everyone, welcome to the lecture 20 of the course Climate Change Extreme Events of we are discussing about the content of week 7. So, in the previous lecture we have talked about primarily two significant floods events and their consequences on different environmental or socio-economic or biodiversity loss like that. One we have discussed about the Uttarakhand flood which occurred in 2013, and then we have also talked about South Indian floods in 2015, like durations like that. We have discussed very briefly about what is the reason behind the factors which are governing mechanism for Uttarakhand 2013 floods, and then we have also discussed about 2015 South Indian floods like that. So, in all these factors, all these flood events, few things were common. For example, climate change exacerbated the whole scenario. Unsustainable human activities which has been led to that kind of increased risk of flood disaster in those region. And then we have talked about for example, what could be the consequences of and what similar floods will occur in certain different parts of the world, or let us say in Indian region, what would be the impact caused by and how we can manage it. So, all these things which we have discussed in lecture 19. In this lecture, we will talk about the Millennium Drought of Australia, and we will primarily focus upon causes, impacts and lessons for future water management. So, Millennium Drought of Australia was one of the worst drought event in the Australian history, which was started in early 1996, and then it went all the way to 2000, 2005, something like that. So, it is like a decadal drought event which occurred in the Australian region and has significantly affected the crop productivity, forested region, their diversity, biodiversity for example, and a severe problem associated with the water scarcity and availability of fresh water resources in Australian regions like that. So, in this particular lecture, we will talk about the causes and duration of these Millennium Drought events in the Australian region. We will examine the socio-economic and environmental impact caused by these drought events. We will analyze the responses, strategies and the policy interventions which was implemented during that drought event and after that drought events like that. And then we will also towards the end discuss about what the lessons we have learned from this particular extreme events in the Australian region, and what could be the future drought resilience, for example, in Indian region or around any other particular regions like that. How we can mitigate or how we can lower down the risk of drought in different parts of the world like that, and have a sustainable water or surface water availability, so that we can at least balance the impact of the caused by these climate induced drought events in different parts of the world. So, this is the overview of the Millennium Drought. It was started in 1996 and it was till mid of 2010. It's a more than 10 years duration then this Australian drought was occurred. There were several regions which were affected, for example, southeastern Australian region including the Victoria or New South Wales and South Australian regions like that. So, one of the longest and most severe droughts in the Australian history, recorded history, and it has been significantly affected the multiple aspect of Australian region. If you look at the rainfall deficit map of Australian region, you can see that there are significant. So, it is this particular map is from 1997, 1st April 1997 to 31st October 2009, and this map is again 1 November 2001 to 31st October 2009. So, it is basically started from 1997, it is started from 2001. So, if you look at the whole complete map, it shows that there are several regions where we have rainfall deficit are very high, almost the 50% of the region of the Australia is showing very much above or highest recorded rainfall deficit in these particular regions, particularly this part of the Australian regions. There are several regions where we do not have a very significant amount of rainfall deficit, but there are deficit in the rainfall. Similarly, when we change the time frame, it is also observed that when we are talking about the rainfall deficit since 2001 to 2009, it was a sort of depletion phase of the drought event in the Australian peninsula or Australian region. Here we observed that the deficit was lower down quite significantly if you compare to the 1997 levels, but still there was several regions which was experiencing a very significant decline in the rainfall amount, almost 50%, and there are several regions. For example, this particular part of the basin is called Murray-Darling Basin, where we have a significant lower amount of rainfall deficit. So, one thing is very clear about this particular maps, that the Millennium Drought conditions in the Australian region were originated because of the lower amount of rainfall, and therefore the increased temperature and increased evaporation, and therefore it exaggerated the whole scenario there, and therefore we have a longer duration drought events in the Australian regions like that. What are the primary reasons of this drought events? That climate factors was one of the most important factors which are influencing the drought phenomena in the Australian region. For example, recorded rainfall was very low because of the ENSO, particularly El Nino Southern Oscillation event which occurred, and therefore we have a very low amount of rainfall which we have seen in the previous slide, that 50% of part of the Australian regions were significantly affected by lower amount of rainfall in that particular periods like that. Further, because of the climate change, we have also observed that temperature extremes are increasing. So, one time when we have, let us say, the low amount of rainfall in a one particular location, at the same time if the temperature is rising, what will happen? The amount of water is very low in that particular location, and because of the temperature rise, the loss of the water will also become very high, evapotranspiration like that. So, therefore, the availability of water become less or become decreasing over the time, and therefore, that kind of a favorable condition for a drought to be occurred in a particular locations. Another factor is human induced factors, which is basically over extraction of the water resources. So, over extraction of the water resources, let us say you have already less amount of rainfall and you have higher amount of temperature extremes, temperature rise like that, and at the same time humans for several different activities, let us say agricultural purposes or household activities or industrial purposes like that, they extracting a lot of water from surface water, from groundwater resources like that, for multiple different purposes of course, and therefore that is further depleting the available resources there and further amplifying the drought conditions in that particular regions like that. The another important factor of the human induced factor is land use conversion or land use change. When you change the land use, let us say if you have removed the forest cover and then you started doing some sort of agricultural practices, or let us say you converted the forest land into a barren land, it is somehow going to impact the electromagnetic radiations and basically how the earth surface is going to be interact with the electromagnetic radiations, the albedo, the reflection and the absorptions, and therefore once we have converted the land use land cover, we have changed it, it is going to change the neighboring the surrounding sensible heat or in that particular locations like that. So, when we have that kind of the impact in a particular locations, that can further amplify the situation of the drought conditions there, and therefore you would have more severe drought events exaggerated by these kind of the human activities. So, on one hand The human activities are extracting more water from the available resources. On the other hand, because of the land use, land cover changes and all, it is basically interfering the the heat characteristics of the surface, and therefore leading to more evaporation or more heat events or like that in that particular regions like that. So, these were the primary reason behind these significant millennium drought conditions in the Australian regions. We can see here the rainfall deficiency and temperature trends. We can observe that this is the plot of the annual precipitation anomaly over the Murray and Darling basin, which was one of the most significant basin of the Australia. So, if we look at here, there are several time period where we have a very low amount of rainfall was recorded. For example, World War II, or there is some events like that. Then we have millennium time period, the millennium drought events, which was like here. We can it extended from 1996 and this, but it is marked like that. So, basically it is we have this event which also shows that a significant decline in the rainfall anomalies in particular Murray-Darling basins, and that is basically revealing the overall the severity of these drought events like that. So, basically the rainfall deficiencies were the primary reason, significant decrease in the precipitation across affected areas, which is because of the below average inflows from the Murray-Darling basin, and therefore the Murray-Darling basin has experienced a very significant crisis of the water availability in that particular region, and particularly the temperature trends, increased evaporation rates due to rising temperature and record breaking heat waves during the drought periods can also lead to some sort of drought conditions in that particular regions. So, I would like to add here, when you are talking about drought event and when you are talking about particularly land use, land cover change or human activities. So, one phenomenon is very common with the drought events, heat waves. So, when we are joining with these two phenomena together, drought and heat waves, it is called compound extremes. So, compound extremes means at the same times we have also the drought event, at the same times we have also the heat waves event. So, if you go and quantify this drought plus heat waves at a particular location, we would be able to tell that what would be the severity of one event or one extreme event, or what is the relationship between one extreme events with the another extreme events like that. Why this happens? Primarily because of the temperature rise and the land use, land cover changes characteristics like that. That is basically triggering all these mechanism together, and when these two events are happening at the same time, it basically amplify the overall socio-economic or losses in a particular locations like that. What was the impact on the water resources? We have talked about Murray-Darling basin. So, Murray-Darling basin has received a very significant lower amount of rainfall, higher temperature, and because of this the lower availability of water was there, and the reservoirs levels dropped very significantly, and because of the reservoir level drops, we could not able to provide fresh water to the primary water related activities, for example agricultural, crop productivity, industrial operations or households. Reduced river flows affect the agriculture and ecosystem further. Then we have also observed during that particular millennium drought conditions, we have a very significant problem associated with the urban water supply. Because of the major reservoir which dropped significantly, we could not provide to properly fresh water to the cities, and therefore it was a very strict water restriction was imposed during that particular period. And because of the unsustainable activities and all, groundwater depletion was also occurred, and therefore we have also observed the increased reliance on the groundwater levels, which is basically long term sustainability concerns, because if you overexploit the groundwater resources during the drought period, it might cause a very significant problem for the future scenarios, because we are overexploiting the available resources unsustainably. So, as we suggested that because of the water, low availability of water in the reservoir, in the surface water, in the groundwater, the major impact was the millennium drought condition was the crop failure. So, we have observed in that particular Australian region wheat, barley and rice production has been significantly drastically declined. There was also reduction in the livestock. Reduced pasture growth leads to multiple further issues, and because of all of these we have also observed a very significant economic consequences. Financial loss estimated in the billions of dollars, and increased food prices and economic downturns in the rural areas like that. So, if you look at this particular curve, this is the logarithms of agricultural TFP, total productions. We can see that since 1961 to 1996 or something like that, it was continuously rising. But during that particular period, Millennium Drought period 1996 to 2010 or mid of the 2010 like that, we observed a very gradual change in the crop productivity or production levels like that, which itself suggests that there is a significant drop in the productivity, primarily driven by the water scarcity or Millennium Drought conditions in that particular region like that. Other consequences was biodiversity loss because of the low availability of water. Multiple wetlands has been disappeared, riparian ecosystem has been suffered, and therefore these are the systems which holds a lot of biodiversity or flora and fauna or different types of animals which lives there in that particular environment. And because of the loss of the wetlands and riparian ecosystems like that, it has significantly affected the biodiversities there. Then we have also observed because of the dry conditions and heat wave conditions, or let us say drought condition at the same time, we have also observed a wildfire, a forest fire there, and that is basically the frequency has been significantly increased, and that has also further affected the biodiversity of the Australian regions like that. And because of these increased desertification, loss of biodiversity, increased temperature and all, soil degradation also happens at the same time. Because of this, we have also observed a sort of desertification and erosion risk, fluvial and wind based erosion events in Australian region, and therefore that further degraded the soil quality or soil availability or the nutrients which should be there in soil, so that plants can be or plants growth can be sustained. So, these are the indirect impact which was caused by these Millennium Drought conditions in the Australian region. So, this map clearly shows that you can see there is a Murray-Darling basin where we have a major portion of the vegetation was available, and because of that particular the drought conditions, this particular region of the forested region of the Australian region has been significantly affected by these drought conditions. So, what was the urban and social impact caused by these Millennium Drought conditions in Australia? Level 5 restriction in the cities like Melbourne and Sydney was imposed, which means the water availability is so poor, so low, that we have to allocate a certain amount of water for necessary activities. So, that was the level 5 restriction was imposed in cities Melbourne and Sydney, and that was the primary reason behind low availability of surface water, and already the surface water has been utilized for multiple purposes or lost because of the heat waves and the drought conditions there. The another impact was public health effects, increased heat stress, respiratory illnesses and other indirect impact also observed. Then we have also community displacement, the migration issues, one place to another place, people have migrated, and because to find better places where we have higher amount of or a high availability of freshwater resources like that. So, rural population has been migrated to urban areas due to economic hardship to sustain their families and all. That is also sort of secondary impacts caused by these extreme climatic events in that particular regions. So, if you look at the timeline of this Millennium Drought, this was begin in early 2000 and 1990s, 90s like that. So, it was gradually decreasing significantly at between 2006 and 7. We have a very low availability of water was available, 16% of the capacity, and that was the peak of this particular drought conditions, where we have Australian government has imposed several policies to particularly monitor or audit the water uses in different sectors, so that they can at least save a certain amount of water for later uses, or let us say mitigate the severe impact of drought events in that particular regions like that. What was the government response and policy measures? If you look at water implementation management strategies, there was significant implementation of the national water initiatives, which means they wants to aware public about how to properly utilize the available surface water, or properly allocate to different sectors like that, so that they can sustainably use whatever the available surface water or groundwater resources are there in that particular regions like that. Then they have also introduced the water trading system. So, whatever the deficit in some sector can buy the water credit or something like that from those sectors where we have water surplus units, and they can manage like that. So, therefore, they can maintain some sort of sustainable or government strategies, so that we can mitigate the significant impact of losing more water in one particular sectors where other sectors are experiencing less water availability like that. Then investment of infrastructure, expansion of the desalination plants, where governments were started thinking about how we can utilize the seawater for fresh water, and then they have started doing some sort of desalination plantations like that. Upgrades to a water recycling and conservation projects, for example dams and reservoirs, so that they can store a large amount of water, and therefore that can be used for low flow conditions or drought conditions, so that we can at least mitigate the effect of drought in the downstream part of the river basin. So, this was started, the National Water Initiative was started, then they have started with the pre-basin plan phase, where response to the degradation, maintain ecological health or inundation, large scale sustainable drought refugees and all they have addressed. Then in between 2007 and 10 they have started the basic plan design phase, where they are talking about triple bottom line, healthy working of basins, resilience, community, food production, etc. Then during the no drought period, when they have just crossover or crossed this particular millennium drought period, they have implemented the maintain the resilience, critical habitat, adaptive management, uncertain future. They are talking about how do we project it for the future, or let us say what could be the future impact of these drought events if they reoccur in that particular regions again. Water security, increased irrigation water and limit economical impact. Then in the evaluation phase they have talked about multiple disastrous outcomes which was implemented before, and they have further re-evaluated that. Trust building with the stakeholders, with the public opinion, with the publics, or let us say government policy makers like that. And climate and adaptation and commitment to plan. So, for example, they have to stick to that particular deadline, so that the plans should be met, and they have at least on the same page with the climate adaptations like that. So, this was the after effect of millennium drought conditions in the Australian regions. People or government has started thinking about how do we implement a proper sustainable measures, policy measures, so that they can at least save some amount of water, so that we cannot have a similar kind of situation in the future time step, because they know that the climate is changing and temperature is rising, and therefore because of the rise of the temperature and the low rainfall amount in the future climate steps as well, these kind of the event might reoccur again, and therefore we have to have a very solid policy measures. If these events will reoccur again in the future, we can at least mitigate the negative impact of these events like that. So, this was the government response and policy measures. What was the technological and scientific interventions in the Australian region? They have started thinking about smart irrigation systems for agriculture. household rainwater harvesting initiatives, so that they can start save a very significant amount of water. Irrigation system, for example, they have moved from the flood irrigation to sprinkler system or more smart irrigation system, so that they can at least save a significant amount of water for later purposes or later uses like that. Then they have started thinking about climate adaptation research, improved seasonal forecasting techniques, drought resistant crop development like that, that can improve our understanding in the future time steps, so that we can minimize our impact or minimize our the water uses for the future steps. So, smart irrigation system, seasonal forecasting, rainwater harvesting and drought resistant crops are one of the key technological interventions or the advancement in that particular sector or region, so that they can at least think about fighting with that particular millennium drought kind of conditions in the future steps as well. What are the lessons we have learned from this millennium? So, this was occurred in the Australian region, and there are several drought events also occurred in the Indian Peninsular region as well, or Indian region, northern Indian, southern Indian part of the region as well. How do we take it forward? Whatever they have implemented in the Australian region, how do we learn from that particular interventions or policy implementations like that, so that we can also mitigate the effect of these drought events in our regions like that. First of all, we have to think about proactive measures, implementing early and effective water management policies. For example, they have talked about smart irrigation, they have talked about rainwater harvesting, they have talked about multiple types of the design modification of the reservoirs like that. So, the proactive measures are important. Then we have to start thinking about the integrated strategies, developing comprehensive plans that unify various drought resilience efforts, and they can come up with one single page or one page that okay, this is the strategy based on multiple inputs, and then we have to follow this particular routes like that. Then we have to conduct more advanced scientific research on the droughts particularly, because if we know about more about the drought pattern, historical pattern, we would be able to find out what could be possible scenarios in the different global GHG emission scenarios like that in drought conditions like that. So, that is also important. So, there are drought events, there are several other types of droughts are also very famous. For example, if you are talking about drought, drought can be your hydrological drought, meteorological drought, agricultural drought, socio-economic drought. So, also drought can be also divided into duration wise also. One is the longer duration drought event, another is a flash drought event. So, flash drought events are basically occurred, the number of days are very short and the deficits significantly dropped the water availabilities. So, that is we have to also think about those types of scientific research advancement, so that we can have a better understanding about how the drought pattern has been evolved, what is the role of climate change, what is the role of human activities, what is the role of let us say land use, land cover, how the reservoir operations are basically mitigating the impact of a drought in a certain regions. Those kind of research are very important to understand overall better understanding of the drought in our Indian regions like that. Then based on all of these interventions, scientific advancement like that, we can have a resilient future which can achieve a state where communities are well prepared and adaptable to climate change challenges, and with proper management of your surface water and groundwater resources, so that we can have a minimum impact on different sectors like that. What is the global relevance and comparison? If you talk about let us say US drought monitor or California, here we have multiple years maps of drought event. You can see that in 2012 very abnormally dry and moderate drought conditions, but as we approach 2014 and 15 we have a significant changes in the drought anomalies like that. So, when you are talking about the historical anomalies, we are also talking about how the droughts propagate spatially as well as the temporally. When we have all these information at one, we can basically predict their pattern. We can understand which area is more significantly affected by the drought impact, and then we can think about tailored strategies or water sustainable measures, so that we can provide to different types of regions where droughts are occurring more frequently, or there are a few regions where the flash droughts are dominating, or there are few regions where we have longer duration droughts conditions like that. So, therefore, we have to learn these conditions as well. There is another case study of South Africa, where we have recently observed a significant decline of your water stored or surface water reservoir levels because of the unsustainable activities, and you can see that it was reached to 20% and like that in between July 2016 to July 2017 particular time. So, this is we have to also think about how we can manage our water resources, how we can optimize our reservoir operation strategies, how we can optimize our overall available surface water resources or groundwater resources, so that we can at least mitigate the impact of drought conditions there. Finally, what would be the future drought preparedness policy recommendation? Strengthening the climate adaptation framework. We have to expand the water recycling and conservation programs. Community engagement are very important. Public awareness campaign on the water conservation, encouraging behavioral change in the water uses. These are some of the steps which are very important when we are talking about drought preparedness for the future time steps as well. So, sustainable infrastructure, which is basically vision for river and community which are dependent upon. Allocations between users, environmental regulated markets and consumption. Then we are talking about, let us say, accounting and metering, which is very important, because if we do not monitor or account the what is the water usage in different sectors, we won't be able to apply for sustainable surface water management practices in those regions. Then we have to think about monitoring and adaptive management, and then we have to repeat all these steps so that we can have flexible and responsible institution that can monitor, and then we have some sort of policy frameworks that can apply in a certain region, so that we can have minimum impact caused by these drought events like that. So, what are the takeaways of this particular lecture is the Millennium Drought was one of the Australia's most severe long term drought events. We have talked about climate and humans both played equally role in its severity, and therefore we have to learn from that particular case study, and then we have to apply in our region, or so that we can minimize the impact of this drought impact in different part of the world as well. Then we have also talked about policy interventions and water conservation strategies are essential for resilience, because when you learn from the historical pattern, when we learn from the behavioral analysis, when you learn from the water usage analysis or reservoir operations, then you can try to framework some sort of policies which can can take the positive aspect of the operations or different procedures and neglect the negative part, which basically amplified the whole situations like that. Or for example, water conservation techniques which we have to promote, and therefore we have to think about how we can manage between surface water, groundwater, available water resources in a certain regions like that. So, this was the overall takeaways of the Millennium Drought conditions in the Australian region. In the next lecture, we will primarily talk about the 2020 heat wave event across northern and central India, which is another type of extreme events case study in the northern and central Indian regions like that. So, this is the in this lecture, this is so far from my side. Thank you so much for your attention.